Wow, look at everybody stacking that NCon. Woo! All right, well, look, they even gave me a podium. So with that, we've got a very exciting keynote speech coming ahead. Chris Donovan, Chief Operating Officer of the NEAR Foundation, will be presenting Closed versus Open, the case for an open web. So please stack up that NCon and give it up for Chris Donovan, ladies and gentlemen.
All right. Hi, everybody. How are we all doing? Enjoying NEARCON so far? I hope. So, I'm super excited to be up here today, and thank you all for taking the time out of your very busy schedules, I know we're all very busy in Web3, to be here with us at NEARCON 2023. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Donovan. I am the COO at the NEAR Foundation, and what I wanted to do today is to briefly make the case for an open web and why I think it is so vital today and also so urgently needed. So the current web paradigm we have today, right, it has revolutionized and it now dominates pretty much every single aspect of our lives, from our social and financial activities, how we travel and work, to how we communicate and even just consume information, particularly news. And the power of these systems is unquestionable, right? And their influence is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And of course, with the recent remarkable advances in AI, and actually built in part on the great work of our esteemed co-founder and CEO, Ilya, the power and ubiquity of these systems is only set to increase further. But there's a problem, a big problem, in fact, in my view, and that despite all of these successes and the amazing things that this technology enables us all to do, the current web paradigm is fundamentally broken. And why is that? Because today, the web is closed. It's built on closed permission systems and infrastructure. And these systems have the effect of concentrating power and wealth, data, and governance in the hands of a very small number of people, the controllers and operators of these platforms. And we as users, we are the product. And privacy is eroded and inequality grows. So that's why the creation of an open web, right, which is what we're all here to do, it has always been the NEAR ecosystem's North Star. But what do we mean by open web? Right, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, so let's try and break it down. So in our view, an open web is built on permissionless autonomous systems and infrastructure, right, without controllers or gatekeepers of any kind, where anyone, anywhere, can access and use these systems to create, participate, and be fairly rewarded for their ideas and effort. And by extension, and to me most importantly of all, this type of infrastructure can actually create guarantees for privacy, for data ownership and portability, and censorship resistance, amongst a whole bunch of other things. Right? And in this digital age, these qualities, they are fundamental human rights. Now, having said all of that, I actually want to dive more into why we need an open web. And I think to better understand that question, let's come back to the current paradigm for a minute. Let's think about the closed web, sometimes also called Web 2. And I mentioned earlier that despite all of the great progress, the current closed paradigm is fatally flawed because it's built on these closed, permissioned systems. And actually, this has a bunch of quite negative and very impactful consequences that are really important for us to recognize. So let's think about a few of those. Gatekeepers. As we all know, the operators of these systems, right, they can control the rules of the game, right, how these platforms operate, who can have access to them, and of course, they can also arbitrarily change the rules of the game whenever they like. And these walled gardens that they create, in order for users and developers and founders to get access to them, they're typically required to give up something. Usually it's their privacy, it's also usually their data ownership, and sometimes a bunch of other stuff as well. And of course, these issues, when it comes to gatekeepers, it's not just a purely online phenomenon, right? If we consider things like the traditional financial system, for example, that, of course, is something that has been operated on a permissioned, gate-kept, closed basis for its entire history, right? And we've seen that accessibility and equality suffers as a result of that. There's also extraction that happens with these Web 2 services, right? Many of them, as we know, they're billed as free. Isn't that fantastic? But actually, they demand trade-offs and sacrifices that users, developers, and founders are just often not aware of, or they might not fully understand because there's no transparency, but actually they have no choice but to accept because they want to use these services. They want access to these goods and these products. But that means that actually these services, they're not free, right? Again, in this world, we are the product, and we give up a huge amount of value when we enter into that bargain. One of the biggest things that we do, actually, is we give up our ability to truly own anything in the current digital paradigm, right? At the moment, in the closed Web 2 paradigm, it operates primarily on what's called a licensed-based model. So that means that you don't have true ownership of any of your digital lives. All that you have is what's called a license. This is like a bundle of contractual rights between you and the platform or the operator, right? And the platform operators typically would retain ownership. And these licenses, as you guys may know, not that you've probably read through all of them, they have reams of terms and conditions. They're extremely dense. They're hard to follow. The terms can be changed at any time, and without notice as well. So the things that you think you own and the things that you think are yours in this paradigm, they're not really. And I think this is probably one of the biggest issues of all, right? So these systems are fundamentally built to optimize two things: pure attention, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in a minute, and profit. And that is at our expense, again, as the users of these services. And of course, like we mentioned, the operators of these platforms, they are continuously updating the rules of the game in order to maximize these two things, attention and profit. And they're getting really, really good at that. They even understand how our brains work neurologically, how we respond to stimuli, how they can make sure that they keep our eyeballs glued to these screens as much as possible. And in fact, they've become so good, like I said, that actually this closed web paradigm, it touches every aspect of our lives. And the controllers and operators of these platforms, they have become extraordinarily powerful and wealthy and have an inordinate amount of influence as a result. And of course, despite all of the progress, like I mentioned, and despite the fact that this technology has unlocked a lot of wonderful things, it is doing a huge amount of damage to us as individuals and actually also to the broader fabric of our societies. So what I'd like to do now is go through a few examples of the negative impact of the open web, right, to try and provide a little bit more context, because people often say to me, they're like, look, Chris, okay, I understand all of that. This is like the 100th time you've chewed my ear off about the open web. But honestly, I don't really see why I should care, right? I just want to be able to use seamless products and services. I want them to be powerful. I want them to be easy. And also, I kind of think I trust that, insert name of random Web 2 tech giant will do right by me, right? I guess I kind of trust them enough. It doesn't really bother me. So let's dive into some examples, I think, in practice to try and make the case as to why we should care about this stuff. So let's start with Kindle eBooks. Right? I'm sure a lot of people in the audience have got an Amazon Kindle. I do too, right? Now, these ebooks that you buy on the Amazon store, right, and they appear on your Kindle, you don't actually own them, right? They are licensed content, like we were talking about earlier. So what does that mean in practice? That means that these books can just disappear from your Kindle, right? No notice to you, no warning, nothing. They can just disappear. Because, for example, Amazon might have changed its licensing policies. Or maybe Amazon is in a dispute with a writer or a publishing house because they disagree with the political views or social views of a particular author, for example, right? And even more sinisterly, the content of these books can be changed unilaterally, without notice, right? So you could go back to reread your favorite paragraphs from one of your favorite books, and it could be different to the last time that you read it, and you wouldn't even necessarily know. Data breaches. Another big problem with this closed, centralized paradigm, right, is that these enormous organizations and platforms, including both technological and traditional, say like traditional financial institutions, as we know, they gather huge amounts of very sensitive personal data as part of how they police and gatekeep access to these goods and services, right? And this creates enormous data breach risks. And actually between March 21 and February 22, there were over 42 million records exposed by data breaches, which is enormous, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? We see new stories of additional security lapses and breaches almost every single day, it feels like. And these things seriously harm individuals, right? With identity theft and financial loss and all the rest of it, it can truly destroy people's lives. And I'm also just, on this topic, going to take a very quick kind of sidebar, right, and just raise the topic of KYC, AML, and sanctions checks, which is a bit of a boogeyman to the Web3 crypto community, right? And by those, by the way, KYC is know your customer, AML, anti-money laundering, and sanctions checks, right? And these are checks that organizations do in order to verify the identity of your counterparty or maybe your customer, right? And the policy outcome of that process is to try and validate that your counterparty is legitimate, right, and isn't a criminal trying to bring criminal proceeds into the financial system. And I think, look, that's a worthwhile and important policy outcome. But of course, the way that these processes are run at the moment is extraordinarily outdated and dangerous. You have copies of passports and utility bills and bank statements flying around the internet and being stored very poorly, and all that it does is expose users to risks, privacy and security. And I think, one of the really important things to recognize is actually that in Web3 today, we have technology to do this process better. Right? Things like zero-knowledge proofs, where you can do these types of identity verifications without having to expose people's sensitive information. And so that means you're getting not just the same policy outcomes, but actually better ones, right? More enhanced protection, not creating all of these risks. Another great example, app stores, right? Web2 app stores, particularly the Apple Store, right? Famously high commission, 30%. So hard for projects even to get admitted. Right? And of course, Apple sets the rules of the game. It decides which apps, which projects it wants to allow in. It can arbitrarily change the rules and kick apps out. We know MetaMask was booted out for a brief period of time and then let back in a couple of weeks ago. But I also, the examples I just talked through, they're quite specific, right? And I wanted to take a step back and for us to think about the broader impact of this closed paradigm, right, on our society as a whole. So for example, right, there are 1.7 billion adults are currently unbanked. And as I said, the traditional financial system, it is the paragon of closed, permissioned approach. Inequality continues to grow, again, underpinned by this closed, permissioned approach. And if you look at this, and there's plenty of other data on this, the concentration of wealth and the levels of wealth inequality are actually the highest that they have ever been in the history of records that we have, right? The previous time that we were even close to this level was on the eve of World War I, and we know what happened after that. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, polarization, right? So we talked about how these permission systems, they optimize for pure attention. And by pure attention, I mean that these platforms, they don't care what kind of attention it is. They don't care if it's attention to truthful content, right, or credible content. They don't care if it's high-quality attention. They just want eyeballs on screens. And the result of that is that these systems, intentionally or not, they have the effect of enhancing the spread of misinformation and therefore increasing social and political polarization. And there's some great research on this topic that I'd recommend anyone with an interest in this to look at. There's a great paper from MIT back in 2018 that analyzed how false and truthful news stories spread on Twitter, right? And this data demonstrated that actually false news stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than true stories, which is crazy when you think about it, right? And it actually takes true stories 6 times as long to reach 1,500 people as it does for false stories to reach the same number of people. And that kind of blows my mind, to be honest, right? That there is an inbuilt bias to falsehood and misinformation, right? And we see the impact and the outcome of that every single day. And this is a great example, right? Where the median Democrat and the median Republican have become more divided and more polarized than at any point, in the history of these records. So, needless to say, right, the world does feel like we're at a bit of an inflection point, and maybe even a precipice of sorts across many different areas and many, many different dimensions as well, right? And the closed permission paradigm has, intentionally or not, been playing an enormous part in either causing or amplifying these issues. Right? And this is a pretty bleak list here, right? Political and social polarization, erosion of trust in everything, geopolitical instability, etc. Right? It's not a nice read. And the trouble is, at the moment, governments and big corporations, the only paradigm they know is this closed permission paradigm. So when they think about how to try and meet and overcome all of these challenges that we were just talking about, they only know one way to do that, right? The closed web way. And so this typically results in increased control, additional permissions, and increased centralization. And of course, that's just a negative feedback loop. It just further enhances and amplifies all of those issues that we were talking about. And again, right now, the closed web, like we said, is extraordinarily dominant. And the permission systems and infrastructure on which it relies are extraordinarily dominant and actually set to become even more dominant, right, as AI is deployed in a closed web environment. And this is happening right now. And frankly, the same should be said of blockchain, right? Blockchain can exist in a lot of different ways, both in an open and closed, permissioned, permissionless environment, right? So blockchain can be used to form the basis, for example, of a pervasive surveillance infrastructure, right? Where every aspect of our lives is monitored and tracked. Maybe it's monitored and maintained by AI. And that sounds a lot to me like a dystopia, right? And I think that's a genuinely non-trivial possibility. I agree, this is all starting to sound a little bit bleak, right? So what to do? So right now, it feels like, the past state that we're in, it doesn't feel sustainable, right? At least, certainly not to me. But looking forward, there is a huge amount of optimism and promise. But also, we have similar risks and similar dangers. But now, we actually have the tools, right, in this room, at this conference, in this industry, to do better. And I actually think we have an obligation to do better, in fact. But we can. We can with an open web, right? That is the corrective to all of these issues that we've just been talking through, right? And it's right here. It's at our fingertips. It's happening right now. And as we said, an open web, it's built on permissionless, autonomous systems. So let's break down what we mean by those two terms, right? So starting with permissionless. So by permissionless, we mean that these systems can be used by anyone, anywhere, at any time, right? No one controls how they're accessed or used. They operate on a peer-to-peer, peer-to-system, or system-to-system basis, and that's it. Anyone can use them. And by autonomous, we mean that the operation of these systems is internally consistent and predefined by a set of rules that operate in the same way for everybody. And those rules will continue to operate in the same way, consistently, without any influence by external third parties, right? And that quality, this autonomousness, it enables censorship resistance, which is vital, but also true data ownership and portability, like we were talking about earlier. And again, a quick little sidebar, thinking about true property ownership, right, and property rights in general. They're very special and unique because unlike just about any other type of legal right, a property right you can enforce against the entire world, against anybody. It's a very powerful thing, right? Whereas contractual relationships, licenses, which are a form of contractual relationship, usually you can only enforce those against your contractual counterparty, right? So they're nowhere near as meaningful, they're nowhere near as powerful. Now, the other great thing about these open permissionless systems, right, is that they can be designed to incentivize something other than pure attention or profit, right? And we can implement them in a way that enables contributors and users to be fairly rewarded for the value and the effort that they put in. But we also need to recognize, and this is one of the biggest challenges I think that we've faced as an industry, that we need to make sure that we give folks a reason to use this technology, right? We need to make the case effectively. We need to match these Web 2 services for convenience, for user experience, and for power. And I think we're making great strides towards doing that. But I think it's pretty clear, right, that the essential component here that underpins this open web vision and this optimistic view of the future is permissionless autonomous infrastructure, just like the NEAR ecosystem's open web stack. Now, Ilya's going to be discussing this later, so I'm not going to steal his thunder. I would not dream of doing that to Ilya. But what I will do instead is talk a little bit about how, at the foundation, we think about supporting an open web ecosystem, right? And you'll see here, we think about three critical areas or buckets that we think all need to be functioning in harmony and sustainably for this ecosystem and for an open web to become a reality, right? So founders, assets, and ecosystem. So let's start with founders, right? These are the brilliant entrepreneurs and the risk takers that are helping us to build the open web, right? And revolutionizing how they offer products and services to their users and their customers, right? And it is their dedication, it is their brilliance and their hard work that is helping to build the open web and actually solve real-world problems, like I said, give people a reason to use this amazing technology and understand the value and the empowerment that it brings. The second area is assets, right? We want founders and projects and builders to come and generate new assets and new value in our ecosystem, right? And that will bring additional capital and additional backers and probably additional founders and additional projects and users into the ecosystem, right? And this has the possibility of creating a virtuous circle, right, that can enable founders and builders to create new projects and also to support the ongoing economic health and vibrancy of the ecosystem. And you know, again, without all of these three pieces working together, we're not going to be successful. So now coming lastly to the ecosystem. And in some ways, right, this is what underpins everything else that we're doing, right? Because the ecosystem, it includes that open web stack that Ilya is going to talk about more, right? The permissionless autonomous infrastructure that we absolutely have to have, right? That makes everything within an open web paradigm possible. But of course, it also consists of everyone here in this room and everyone else across the ecosystem, this amazing, vibrant ecosystem that we have, and all of these enormously talented founders and builders, you know, leveraging that technology and making use of those assets and that value flowing into the ecosystem to build new projects, to bring value to their users, and ultimately to build an open web. And so the ecosystem is where all of this stuff comes together, right? And that is why the Foundation's mission has always been to support the ongoing growth and development of an autonomous and decentralized near ecosystem, and therefore, by extension, an open web. And at the Foundation, we are unequivocally laser-focused and committed to bringing our considerable resources to bear in support of this open web mission, right? And we believe that together, all of us here in this room, not just us at the Foundation, but as an ecosystem, and frankly, as an industry, we have an opportunity to make this open web vision a reality. And like I said earlier, this is not just an opportunity, right? I think it's also an obligation that we have to do this, right? To make this a reality. So look, on that note, I wanted to thank you for listening, and I wanted to ask you to join me to step into and to help build and support an open web at this year's NEARCON. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening.